Wikipedia, the free encyclopedia that anyone can edit, went from being a weird online experiment 21 years ago to one of the mainstays of the modern internet with astonishing speed. Even more astonishing, it has maintained its reputation and functionality since its founding, even as the rest of the social internet seems hell-bent on tearing itself apart. As Twitter, Facebook, and others are consumed with controversy over moderation, governance, and the definition of free speech, Wikipedia continues to quietly grow in utility, trustworthiness, and comprehensiveness. There are now nearly 6.5 million articles in the English version alone, and it has held its place in the top 15 most visited sites on the internet for well over a decade. Reason spoke with Wikipedia's founder, Jimmy Wales, who was predictably modest about what he got right. A key ingredient in Wikipedia's success is its high degree of decentralization. After this interview was conducted, Elon Musk made a bid to buy Twitter, bringing new salience to the battle over who controls the flow of information and disinformation online. Reason last spoke with Wales 15 years ago, and the resulting profile ended up becoming a source for Wales' own Wikipedia entry. At that time, we talked about the role that Friedrich Hayek played in Wales' thinking, the future of online speech, and improving the algorithms that shape our lives. This conversation picked up where we left off. Hi, Jimmy. It's really nice to see you again.
Great. Yes. Very good to see you. It's been a long time.
Last time we talked was 2007, I think. And we hung around in Florida. We had some Indian food. And I want to kind of go back to that day to establish where really not just you were, but I think the world was in terms of mindset. On that day, you said there's a certain kind of dire anti-market person who assumes that no matter what happens, it's all driving toward one monopoly, the ominous view that these companies are going to consolidate into the matrix. So you said basically radical decentralization will win out. Were you right?
I don't know. Good question. I think so. I mean, we still have a pretty radically decentralized web. Obviously, we have some big players, with Facebook, Amazon, Google, et cetera, et cetera. And I think aspects of that market are now pretty narrowly, there's a few players who dominate. I would say like the online digital advertising space is a handful of players. But certainly for the consumer internet, there's still a huge amount of choice. And I even now worry about some of the bigger companies like Facebook are becoming regulation friendly in a way that I suspect has more to do with consolidating their position than being happy about being regulated. So I think there's a lot to keep an eye on.
So we're kind of at a point where I would say not just broad swaths of the internet, but our whole politics, you mentioned regulation, are already being consumed with the debate over content moderation and misinformation. And it seems to me, and maybe this is just a too optimistic outsider's view, but it seems to me that Wikipedia quietly got a bunch of those things right a really long time ago. And it's weird that those lessons haven't been generalized. Is that because they aren't generalizable? Is there something special about the Wikipedia project of building an online encyclopedia that anyone can edit? Or are other players in the space just missing a thing that Wikipedia got right?
Well, I mean, I think it's interesting because I do think there are a lot of the lessons from Wikipedia that could be applied more broadly. While at the same time, I think we do have to acknowledge that, when your website's functionality is, there's a little box that says, "What's your opinion? Tell us what you think." That generates a lot of controversial commentary. By its very nature, people are going to say things that are offensive to other people. They're going to say things that are offensive to almost everyone. And you end up needing to draw certain kinds of lines in a way that is really hard to do. Whereas with Wikipedia, the box is, write an encyclopedia article or talk about the articles. And we've always had a sort of an ethos around, if you go to the discussion page for the entry on Donald Trump, it's not really a place to go and rant about Donald Trump. It's a place to talk about the article and how could we improve it? And is it biased? Is it good or bad? And obviously those discussions can get quite heated, but it is within a framework of saying, no, we're actually here with a particular task in front of us versus, a little box that says, tell me what you think. And So the social media companies do have a very, very hard sort of task they've set themselves. And, I don't think the answer, which is currently being bounced around in some quarters, that, they should be required to basically apply the First Amendment standards as what they think is okay to have on the platform. Because I'm like, well, gosh, no, because things that are absolutely and quite properly legal to say don't make for a really nice online experience. And there's all kinds of groups and all kinds of places where that would be deeply inappropriate. I mean, you can just imagine, a Bible study group that's being sort of infiltrated by raging atheists. It's like, okay, maybe it's okay for people to go, actually, a part of the First Amendment and the spirit of the First Amendment is not just being able to say anything you want, anywhere you want, but actually being able to create some spaces like an online group where you can talk to people of a like mind and have a civil discussion and kick people out if they're just being rude. And so, that where I see real opportunity for change for the social networks, applying some of the lessons of Wikipedia, is to really put more control in the hands of the users. We have a model in almost all social networks that really, I call it the feudal model, which is we're all serfs on the master's estate in a sense. If you go to YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, the boundaries of what you're allowed to say and do are set in a very opaque way by moderators who work for the company, and they're making decisions, and they, I think, do as good a job as they can do, but it's kind of a hopeless, impossible job. In fact, it's quite a terrible job in many cases, because they're forced to look at the worst content, to make very hard decisions. Whereas I think if we had designs that were really more about small group collaboration, small group dynamics, about giving people the ability to control their space, I think there's lots of interesting ways forward, and there's lots of lovely places online that are like that. So,
yeah. So there's a lot of hype right now about decentralized autonomous organizations, and obviously Wikipedia is not on the blockchain, but is that the kind of thing you're talking about when you say, it should be more about the users, it should be decentralized? Yeah. Is Wikipedia like a proto DAO? I mean, is that is that a fair characterization?
In what I was just saying, I wasn't really thinking about DAOs, but I do think it's an interesting area to think about. And lots of people from the DAO world think of that and say to themselves, Wikipedia was like the first DAO in a weird kind of way. I'm not really sure that's an accurate analogy, but it's certainly an interesting analogy, because there are certain, concepts with, some of the good thinking around these distributed autonomous organizations of people being participants and people having control, rather than just being, sort of a customer on a platform. And I think that ability for people to come together in a very lightweight way to form partnerships, to divide up money, typically is part of what you can do there, is actually super interesting. The idea, one of the old concepts that I see bandied around sometimes in sort of the pro-market literature is there's this concept of a friendly society. So this is sort of precursor to big insurance, where people come together and they, in a small group, and they all contribute to a pot of money. And if somebody falls on hard times, they can access that pot of money. And the group kind of makes the rules and decides what to do about it, which doesn't necessarily scale to tens of millions of people. You end up basically with an insurance company, which is fine. There's nothing particularly inherently wrong with that. But there's something really interesting and potentially powerful about a group of people coming together, using the DAO as a mechanism to say, yeah, we're all going to contribute a certain amount to this pot. And, if someone's house burns down or something like that, this will be a fund of money. Or if somebody gets COVID or something like that, like this is a pot of money that we're going to share out in a way that then makes very lightweight structure for doing something that traditionally we've found very hard to do, or it's highly regulated, like insurance, or the government does it. And so I just think that's interesting. Now, whether any of that actually is about to happen or to take place. I'm not sure. But it certainly seems that there's a possibility for using technology, smart contracts, to do some interesting new things.
Do you think, just broadly speaking, there are a lot of people who are very, very worried about the future of online speech and of, what are we going to do about disinformation? And also, how are we going to preserve spaces for heterodoxy? Obviously, all of those questions are very, very related. I guess my first question for you is, in that cluster, what's the thing you're worried about? Are you worried that we have too much speech? Are you worried we have the wrong speech? Or is there something else that debate itself is missing?
Well, I think what I worry as much about as anything is when politicians are worried about too much speech or wrong speech, they're probably up to no good. And that's something we have to remember. There are some really tough problems. Even if we, come at it from a very, libertarian-y kind of perspective, online harassment, threats, sort of really vicious, horrible trolling, that's none of that is what we want. That's not what any of us want. You want your sort of grandma to be able to go on the internet and not get harassed and sort of awful things done. And so we want to make sure we're building spaces that people like and can enjoy and have a positive experience. I think a big part of what's gone on is the current business model, and this will reflect a little bit back now to DAOs a little bit, but the current business model, which is pure advertising for social media, is problematic. It's problematic, and it drives certain outcomes that I think other business models would be better at dealing with. So, just to give an example, the classic kind of way I think about this, I think this came from a book called "Everything Bad is Good for You." I can't remember who it's by, but if you make this in print, you can pretend I knew who it was, but it's slipping my mind. But there was an example in there of like the move from pure advertising television. So, the era of, it's even the example is a little awkward now, the Cosby Show, because Cosby obviously turned out to not be what we all thought at the time. But the Cosby Show was written to be broadly appealing to almost everybody. It's a good quality show. It's a family show. Everybody can watch it. It's not offensive. It's good. And then as we began to move towards, paid programming, so things like HBO, then you had, Sex and the City, and you had The Sopranos, so stuff that wouldn't be suitable for all audiences, in fact, deliberately designed to appeal to certain narrow audiences. And the incentive there for HBO was they wanted to have at least one show that at least one person in every household would pay for. So that might be, they might have shows that had like really good children's programming because they knew maybe some people will pay for children's programming and so forth. And so because their incentives were different, they made a different kind of shows. And then obviously today we see this exponentially. We're in this, I would say, golden age of television with so many fantastic series on Netflix, Amazon Prime, and all of those things. And it's not ad supported. And so the point is not to bash advertising as a business model, but just to say, look, when you've got advertising as a business model, it drives your incentives in a slightly different way than people paying you for the content. And so, I think that when we now think back and we think about, are there other ways of financing things? Obviously, Wikipedia is a huge exception. No ads whatsoever. It's funded by donations by the general public largely, so small donations. But you can imagine other business models where, it's some sort of a partnership. All the people who are joining the site are part owners of the site and are paying for the site and that sort of thing. And you can start to think about beginning to do those things at scale using some of the ideas from DAOs. I don't know if people are going to do that, but to me, it's a fertile area for potentially resolving some of the real problems we see.
Right. And I think sometimes this conversation, it sort of starts out in the same place you started, which is to say, hey, there are some unintended consequences of an advertising model, and then goes right to the problem must be profits, or the problem must be that it's a commercial enterprise at all. And that's not what you're saying here.
No, exactly. I mean, I do think there are good and robust reasons why Wikipedia is and should be a nonprofit, but it's not the only possibility, right? There's all kinds of things that are interesting, and not everything. I talk about one of my favorite little places online. There's like a Lord of the Rings message board site. I think it's called onetruering.net or something like that. Anyway, lovely place. They have been somewhat active about their concerns are about copyright law. It's a discussion board. People post things, and if they're forced to sort of do pre-upload filtering, they won't be able to afford it. They're probably going to need to move their entire community and their entire platform onto Facebook group or something like that, which would be a huge tragedy because it is a sort of a small, sweet place online that's been there for many, many years now. And so you think about, places like that, and that's sort of a hobby site. I don't even know if they have ads, but if they do, it's a few. But they, you begin to think, okay, well, couldn't that group sort of finance themselves somehow as a partnership or a DAO, where they come together and they all contribute money, and then maybe they can do kind of extra special fun things with the money, fund scholarships for people to come to conventions and things like that. Who knows what they might want to do with it. And it could be quite interesting and quite cool and such a more positive outcome than everything sort of moving to Facebook.
Let's talk for a minute about Section 230. You are, I think it's fair to say, a fan.
Very vocal fan.
It's 1996, and we put these words into the Communications Decency Act, right? It's just this very small number of words that turns out to be very powerful. That no provider or user of an interactive computer service shall be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Doesn't sound like it should be the thing on which the entire internet rests, but recently there has been a move to revise or repeal these words. People sort of blame Section 230 for a lot of what they don't like about the internet. What's going on there? What are people misunderstanding?
Well, I mean, I think a big part of it is it's the sort of tension that I think we always have around freedom of expression, which is people get very eager to want to fight misinformation or disinformation through some legal process, which in the US is typically very, very, very hard to do because the First Amendment is very, very strong. It doesn't stop people from being tempted. And so a lot of the time when you see people advocating for it, you basically, if you dig a little deeper, what you see is they really, really want to see the speech they don't like banned and the speech they do like not banned. And they often think they've got some clever formula that makes that work. But then, if you talk to Donald Trump, right, he would like to have Section 230 repealed so that he could force Twitter to let him back on Twitter. And other people are like, no, Donald Trump is the problem, right? and the disinformation from Q and all of those kinds of crazy things that have happened are the problem. And so I think people should just take a deep breath and say, you know what, actually, if the issues are, that there is disinformation and misinformation, probably Section 230 isn't where you need to look. It's a very simple sort of rule that makes possible, content moderation at all. And I don't think anybody serious thinks that, it should be illegal for a Bible study group to kick out unbelievers if they want to, right? That's a big part of freedom of expression, is having your own private space for a conversation without trolls coming in. And so that sort of thing, there's no simple solution. And certainly Section 230 isn't the problem.
We have just in the last few days, Elon Musk has woken up and decided maybe he should start his own social media network. Maybe he's actually just, now he's ended up grabbing a fairly large stake in Twitter. He's not the only person who has had this thought. You have had this thought, right?
Yeah.
You have a social media venture of your own. Can you talk about, I suspect that your line of reasoning and Elon Musk's might at least be semi-related, although I would never speculate about the contents of your respective brains.
Right. Yes. I'm not actually sure what Elon's views are on this matter, so I haven't actually looked into it. I just saw you taking a big stake in Twitter, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
So the concept of Wiki Tribune Social, or wt.social is the URL, it's basically, it is a pilot project. It's a small community. We're working on the software and we're thinking through things with the community and seeing what people are liking and doing. But the fundamental concept is to pursue a different business model. So no ads, no paywall. You just pay if you want to. That's the Wikipedia model. And people do pay, so that's good. But it's not a great business model, that's for sure. Like, it's not lucrative at all. And in fact, we're not making money. And so there is a big question about, okay, how do we do this? How do we move forward here? But the purpose of that business model and the purpose of the experiment is to really think in a really hands-on and deep way about how do your incentives shift, right? If we ran ads, our incentives would end up being exactly the same as every other social platform, which is, get as many page views as possible. And one of the ways to do that is to stoke controversy and have controversy on the site. And if I want to have a more thoughtful, kind of slow and reflective place, then if the business model is you only pay if you really want to, then you really have to say, okay, we need to build a place that people are like, I actually love this enough that I want to pay for it. Like, it's worth paying for. It's meaningful to me. And how to do that, I'm not sure yet. We're working on it. But it is a very different kind of approach than to just sort of say, it's actually, in my view, it's similar in a sense to the Cosby Show. In other words, try to make something that is massively popular to as many people as possible, and shifting to say, no, it's something that is good enough that at least some people will be willing to pay for it. And it's just a different approach that leads us already, like you can sort of, in the decisions we make, it's already pushing in a different direction. Like I barely ever look at things like, time on site and how to increase people being on the site. Now, obviously, you can't ignore that completely. It's sort of like, I made a great show, but nobody even wants to watch it. Isn't a successful recipe for a Netflix series. So you can't completely ignore audience, but it makes it less it's more, I want to get people who actually care, who think this is worth supporting.
It sounds like a lot of this is an emphasis on kind of the freedom of assembly side of things rather than the freedom of speech side of things. So, like, that's one way of thinking about it.
That is one way of thinking about it, for sure. I mean, that's interesting because these days people don't talk as much about freedom of assembly as they talk about freedom of expression. And so you don't see the same kinds of confusions around freedom of assembly just because people aren't talking about it to be confused. It's sort of, it's not that hard. You can go on Twitter anytime and see where somebody's claiming that Twitter is violating their First Amendment rights. And of course, if you know the law, it's like, starts out with Congress shall make no law. It literally doesn't apply to Twitter. But freedom of assembly is actually a super interesting sort of way of thinking about, and actually the relationship between freedom of assembly and freedom of expression is super interesting because it's one way we solve, it's like, I can have I keep saying Bible study group. I want different examples. I'm not actually Bible study
it's fine.
group.
Go to Bible study group again.
It's a fine example, right? It's everybody understands that it's a pretty, peaceful activity. People get together and they study the Bible, and they kind of need space that's sort of a group of like-minded people. And that, in real life, no one says, yeah, I tried to go down to the church and stand in the front row and scream against, the teachings of Jesus, and they violated my rights by kicking me out. No, it's like, no, they actually have a right to be in their own space and to talk about what they want to talk about without you bothering them. So, right.
Talk to me briefly about your politics these days. I will say I checked your personal philosophy section on your Wikipedia page. It's a little out of date. There's nothing really recent there. Yeah. Years ago when you and I talked, we talked about your kind of objectivism and objectivist roots. I see a bunch of different labels that you've used for yourself over time. Do you have a label you like right now? And if so, what is it?
No, I don't really. I mean, I think one of the interesting things is in the past, I I used the label libertarian, but even when I did, it was in a very cautionary way, because there's a lot that might go under that heading that I wouldn't agree with. I basically, for the most part, I avoid talking publicly about politics, except on the narrow issues where I feel like I have a responsibility and a voice. So you won't hear me pontificating about Obamacare, for example, because nobody really cares about what distributing think about healthcare policy. I'm not an expert, and it's not my field. And, I have opinions, of course, but people are interested, and I do know what I'm talking about. If you ask me about Section 230, I'm like, okay, I can tell you all about it, and I have a strong view that I'm very happy to talk about. And so, so that's it.
Do you think that we certainly have more speech, right? We have more ways to talk to each other. We are talking to each other a lot more on at least one theory that should mean or could mean that we now are better at getting more truth, that we are sort of better at getting to real answers or important underlying principles. Do you think we are closer to knowing what's true?
I think that we have the potential to do that. I'm not sure we're doing it in general. I mean, one of the things that I talk about that I think is a problem, I give the example of, it's a stereotype example of, everybody understands the stereotype, your cranky racist uncle, right? Now, I'm always very careful to say, my uncles are all wonderful. I don't have a crazy racist uncle, but we all know the type. And so this is someone who, 40 years ago might show up at Thanksgiving or Christmas dinner or down at the pub with their friends with really sort of stupid and offensive opinions and spout off about them. And that's fine. That's a family problem. If anything, it's not a huge deal. Where I do think it problematic is that if today crazy racist uncle goes on Facebook and starts ranting, and then the algorithm picks up that everybody's responding to that and that it's causing a stir and that it's a lot of page views, and then crazy racist uncle ends up with 5,000 followers on Facebook that are generated not because Facebook thinks, ooh, there's a view we'd like to promote, but just because their algorithm is like, ooh, there's noise, let's turn that volume up so we can have more page views. And again, that goes back to, as you pointed out, I'm not criticizing the profit motive there. I'm just saying the business model is a bit broken, and it's a bit problematic if that's what you're incentivized to do. I don't want to be a customer of that. I would rather, just as I hardly ever watch advertising-based television anymore, I watch shows I like on Netflix and Amazon Prime and so forth. So I hope that we can start to move to other business models to kind of say, yeah, that doesn't work because you end up promoting kind of the worst people, and they get a big following and it sort of breaks democracy. So that's bad.
What are the shows you like?
Yeah. Oh, I love Marvelous Mrs. Maisel. That's a fantastic
show.
Oh,
okay.
Highly recommend.
I approve.
Yes.
Let me throw in one last question and then I'll let you go. Yeah. What trend are you most excited about in tech or anywhere in the world? What direction are we doing that we're heading the right way?
That's a good question. I mean, I think one of the things that I am very intrigued by is and it's slowly improving and it's an ongoing rise in subscription models for journalism. Because I do think that for all the reasons I've talked about before, a pure advertising model can lead you down a very tempting path of clickbait headlines and so forth because it gets more page views. Whereas if people are going to pay you, you kind of have to sort of think about what it is that really makes them love you enough to pay for it. And so, I would hope that we see more sort of success in magazines and newspapers being able to actually get people to pay them.
You are not going to have the editor of Reason Magazine argue with you about that.
Yeah. Well, Reason's actually a good example of something interesting that I feel like Forbes magazine, in my opinion, the Forbes website is completely ruined. Like it's not what it used to be when it was a sort of a mainstream serious business magazine. It's kind of a bunch of clickbait junk. maybe it isn't completely all that, but lately, every time I go there, I find it's sort of like that. And so, like, Reason is a great example of you have a niche audience. You want it to be as big as possible, of course, but you've got a particular view, and a large sort of segment of society is very interested in that, and you have the ability to attract that audience and get them to pay. Whereas if you're really forced too far towards just a pure advertising model, you start to think, oh dear, maybe these kind of we need to be super controversial with our opinions, or we need to kind of provoke people in a way that's not converting them or teaching them or sort of serving your main customer base. Or you might say, wow, we ran one article about kittens and it got a huge response. Let's do more kitten articles, which is kind of bonkers, right? You're a magazine with a purpose. So anyway, great.